Let's break down 6 players to add last minute off of the waiver wire moving into week 14 of the 2024 fantasy football season. These are 6 of the best players who are going to help you guys dominate a week where we have 6 teams on bye week, as well as 6 players that could help you as we move in to the fantasy playoffs. All right, so let's kick the video off with Braelon Allen of the New York Jets. If you have not already entered the Braelon Allen sweepstakes in your respective fantasy league, you need to do so immediately. I was actually a little bit surprised he only sits at 40% rostered. One thing we have talked about a lot over the past couple weeks is the incredible playoff schedule that Breece Hall, in theory, has for the fantasy playoffs this season. But Breece Hall is going into week 14 as doubtful as he deals with that knee injury that's been kind of floating around in the air the past 2 or 3 weeks as a real possibility that could affect Breece Hall as we move into the final stretch of the fantasy season. But then he played in week 13 against the Seattle Seahawks, and he wasn't bad. He had 5 yards per carry. He just didn't have a great fantasy day. Didn't score, didn't have any receptions, had 2 fumbles, and a lost fumble included. But you go back to week 11 before the bye week for the Jets, he had 31 fantasy points, but that is supposedly the game in which Breece Hall hurt his knee. And we don't have any real idea like what kind of knee injury this is or how severe it is. But if this is an issue that's going to move into the final stretch of the season, especially when the Jets are more than likely eliminated from playoff contention, because keep in mind they are not technically eliminated yet, then Braelon Allen is more than likely going to step in as a starting running back for the Jets. Now, you could see some touches to Isaiah Davis, who got involved in the pass game this past week, but Braelon Allen has kind of had that it factor all season long as a handcuff running back. We've seen some standalone value out of him. He's not as good as Breece Hall. I will say that straight up. A healthy Breece Hall, much better than Braelon Allen. You guys know throughout the course of this entire fantasy season, I have been a Breece Hall supporter. I encourage you guys to buy low on Breece Hall for weeks before that big week 11 performance, right? And we talked about this strength of schedule for the fantasy playoffs for weeks and weeks here on the channel. But now we're moving into what could be a very realistic possibility of Braelon Allen being the starting running back for that fantastic stretch. And he's currently sitting at 40% rostered. He's going to get the Jacksonville Jaguars, the LA Rams, and the Buffalo Bills. He is a must-add player, regardless of how large your league size is. This could be a league-winning running back to wrap up the season. He gets Miami here in week 14. It's not the best matchup. It's not the worst matchup. But if he goes into this week truly as a starting running back, he's going to have a ton of fantasy value. There's only so many options out there left for the remainder of the season. So Braelon Allen is available, sitting at 40% rostered. He is a must-add player going into week 14 of the season and possibly for the fantasy playoffs as well. Next up, let's take a look at Sincere McCormick of the Las Vegas Raiders. And now this one, of course, once again, we're kind of looking at a couple different things affecting this scenario, right? Let's just start with what McCormick has done in his first 2 starts as a running back. 3.3 fantasy points off of 5 touches in week 12 against Denver, yet 6.6 yards per carry. This past week against the Kansas City Chiefs, just 8.5 fantasy points, 12 touches, 64 yards on the ground, but 5.3 yards per carry. He's been pretty efficient when given the opportunities, and the Raiders coaching staff has recognized that and said that McCormick is earning more touches as the season starts to wrap up here, right? And he has been signed to the active roster. He's no longer on the practice squad. He didn't get, booted back to the practice squad or anything like that, as we are looking at Alexander Mattison potentially playing this week, but he is still listed as questionable. And what we do know is that it looks like McCormick is going to get more touches than Amir Abdullah. Abdullah, nice in the passing game, kind of has that type of upside, but has not been necessarily great running the football, right? So I think McCormick is truly going to get these touches that the Raiders coaching staff has come out and said that they're going to give him. The bigger question this week is Alexander Mattison going to play this week? If Mattison doesn't play, which we still don't know at the time of recording this, then McCormick, I think, is a viable streaming option at running back if you're completely depleted due to the second part of the biocalypse with 6 teams on bye week. But we got to see if Madison plays. Now, even if Madison plays, McCormick has some sort of value here. It's just it gets really murky and a lot more risky. But what we do want to pay attention to here, especially if Madison doesn't play this week, is if McCormick comes out, has a solid game, then he's got a pretty decent strength of schedule to wrap up the season. Week 15 is not fantastic. He gets the Falcons, but okay. I mean, they're like 11th or 12th against running backs. It's not great, but I don't know. He could do something in that game, could score, could get you a low ceiling kind of floor type play. But then week 16 and 17, much, much better. This is where really made me want to talk about McCormick, because he gets Jacksonville in week 16, then the New Orleans Saints in week 17. So, there is a good shot here that we see very little Zamir White, who is out here in week 14, and Alexander Madison to wrap up the season. And the Raiders try and take a look at what they have in McCormick, as they are definitely, for the most part, a young team trying to move into next season. So McCormick, it's still risky. The water's a little murky here, but this is a player sitting at 10% rostered who could end up helping you out in week 14 and maybe even down the stretch as we wrap up the fantasy season. All right, looking at some wide receivers, we got to start with my guy, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, a player we have been talking about on the channel as early as week 8 of the season. I just started to notice that trend. He had 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games, a double-digit performance in week 8. And, we make a lot of videos here. We have a sneaky starts video. We have a last-minute waiver ad video. I'm always trying to kind of look a little bit deeper for you guys. And then for weeks, we've been talking about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. I've been trying to get you guys on this train, and now it's a little bit trendy to talk about my guy, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. At least it has been over the last 2 weeks. He has a touchdown in every game except for 1 since week 6. He has double digits in 3 of his last 4 games. He's had double digits in 5 of his last 6 games in fantasy, right? 11.9 or more fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 starts. And I'm a little bit surprised he's only sitting at 48% rostered, although I know we have a lot of players on bye week, so like the roster decisions are a lot tougher this week. But if he's out there and available, I think you have to stash him. You just have to look at what he's done over the past couple of weeks, the opportunities he's been given, and then the strength of schedule for the remainder of the fantasy season. Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Jacksonville again in the fantasy football championship this year. What are we waiting for, right? And so many guys have picked up Nick Westbrook-Ikhine finally, and you're like, do I play him? Well, he's playing Jacksonville this week. They're giving up the 30th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. This is your time to start Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. And the rest of these matchups to wrap up the season are fantastic. This is as good of a flex option at wide receiver that you're going to pick up for the remainder of the fantasy season. The consistency has been there. The opportunities have been there. The touchdowns have been there. And now the strength of schedule to wrap up the season is fantastic. I don't know what else to say. But if Nick Westbrook-Ikhine is out there and available, pick him up. He's going to be a potential league winner this season. I know I talked about this line on Underdog earlier in the week, but I'm still staring at Nick Westbrook-Ikhine to score a touchdown against Jacksonville this week on Underdog. If you don't know, all new users who sign up on Underdog using the promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, get a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 14. I'm taking that free Pick'em if I'm you. I'm taking this Nick Westbrook-Ikhine to score a touchdown, because once both of those hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And these both are going to feel like free Pick'ems this week, because Nick Westbrook-Ikhine has this fantastic matchup against the Jaguars and a strong chance to score a touchdown this week. And on top of that, when you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH, you're also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. So let's look at Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers, a player that I was telling you guys to go out and quote-unquote stash starting in like week 10. Once we started to get those rumors that he was going to be back sooner rather than later, and then going into week 12, told you guys stash him. Don't necessarily play him against the Chiefs. Sit back and see what happens. But going into last week, encourage you guys to start Adam Thielen as kind of like a desperation flex play with plenty of upside against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he came through, finished with 23.9 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 grabs, 99 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And let's face it, should have been 2 touchdowns, right? And now going into week 14, as a reminder, I don't really like Adam Thielen this week. Don't love that matchup against the Eagles for him. He's a desperation play only. But then the schedule does improve a bit. He gets Dallas in week 15. We'll take it. Week 16, Arizona, not a great matchup, but not awful. But what you really want to look at here, especially if Adam Thielen does have a bad game, gets dropped, is kind of fluctuating out there on the waiver wire. Week 17, he'll play Tampa Bay again in a fantastic matchup. We want to start wide receiver 1s and 2s against this Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary, right? They've already established this and seen it this past week, right? And I really think that Adam Thielen is a potential player who will get dropped, and you might be able to get back up off the waiver wires. The season starts to wrap up, right? And one thing here is like the Panthers are probably going to be eliminated from playoff contention pretty soon here, or I don't feel like checking, but they may have already been eliminated. But I don't think they're necessarily going to wrap up the season just laying over, right? They're going to see what they've got here. And Bryce Young, give him as many offensive starts and snaps as possible. We've already seen such an improvement over the past couple of weeks with Bryce Young that they're going to want to go into next season knowing truly what they have to the highest degree possible in Bryce Young. So they're going to be going out here and trying to win these football games and put up offensive numbers. So I'm not worried about them just completely like falling off here at the end of the season, having no offensive firepower or anything like that. So Thielen, it's a little bit shaky here due to the schedule, but that week 17 matchup against Tampa Bay is the main reason to go out and add Thielen. He could be a player who has a huge week 17, helps you guys win your league this season. Next up, let's talk about Brandon Cooks of the Dallas Cowboys, a player who made the sneaky starts video this week, and a player who I'm pretty excited about to wrap up the fantasy season. Going into week 14, he has a great matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals. And this past week was that first game back, right, from the knee injury that he suffered. He had a knee infection. I honestly thought Cooks was probably going to miss the rest of the season, but came back and looked really good. I mean, 7 targets, just 3 grabs, but 16 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, 10.6 fantasy points against the Giants. And the rest of season schedule here is pretty good, right? Cincinnati, Carolina, Tampa Bay. Then a tough matchup against Philly in week 17. But the next 3 weeks, Brandon Cooks could easily come in here and be a viable flex option for your fantasy roster. And on top of that, we have CeeDee Lamb a little bit banged up, right? I mean, he still has only practiced in a limited capacity as we're moving in to the weekend, right? So CeeDee Lamb is in a position where, I mean, he could just kind of shut things off at any point in the season. I was almost kind of expecting that as he's been dealing with multiple injuries over the past couple of weeks, but he's continued to play through them. So kudos to CeeDee Lamb because that's helped us for the most part in fantasy, maybe outside of last week, right? But the other thing here is Cooper Rush is not playing that bad, right? I mean, he's a viable backup quarterback who can get the football to some of these playmakers, especially in these softer matchups. So, I mean, I'm not worried about the quarterback situation here. I don't exactly know what the Cowboys are going to look like down the stretch. Like, I have more faith in the Panthers offense as we wrap up the season than the Cowboys offense, for example. But there are good matchups here, and Brandon Cooks is either going to be the wide receiver 2 or the wide receiver 1 for the Cowboys to wrap things up. He completely outpaced Jalen Tolbert this past week, who, was the wide receiver 2 for the time that Brandon Cooks missed. And Kevontae Turpin did have 5 targets this past week, which was one more target than Jalen Tolbert, but Brandon Cooks still out-targeting all of those guys, right? So I think that Brandon Cooks could be set up for success. Plus, we know Cooks is has not been a bad fantasy option over the past couple of years. Hasn't been anything more than a flex as of late, but don't forget he had 8 touchdowns, 657 receiving yards last season, and was a flex option last year as well. So I think that Cooks could end up being one of these kind of sneaky guys who you're just kind of like, oh, Brandon Cooks is scoring fantasy points and scoring touchdowns. Kind of weird as the season wraps up, but I think he can definitely be an option to add off of the waiver wire for week 14, getting the Bengals this week, but also as the season progresses. Last player that we're going to talk about is Calvin Austin of the Pittsburgh Steelers, currently sitting at 7% rostered. He's had double digits and a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. This past week, a low volume game. The week before, a low volume game, and he did get a head injury concussion in this past game, but he's been cleared off the injury report going into the week and has a great matchup against the Cleveland Browns this week in week 14. I don't know if you guys watched Monday Night Football this past week, but apparently the Browns and Broncos like to invite opposing offenses to score points, especially at the wide receiver position. This is a smash spot for Calvin Austin. And like I just mentioned, he played the Browns 2 weeks ago, had 16.8 fantasy points and a touchdown. We've also seen Austin just kind of pop up at times on the season, 19.5 fantasy points in week 3, 20.4 in week 8. Fast player, right? And the interesting thing here is, like, we've kind of been waiting for somebody to emerge as a wide receiver 2 for the Steelers team. And we saw some flashes of Van Jefferson as well. We saw Mike Williams have 1 catch so far at the Steelers. That was a big touchdown. But just looking for somebody to emerge behind George Pickens and kind of give this offense another dimension, so to speak, because while this offense has been good on the season, right, it's really just been Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, George Pickens, and some sprinkles of Pat Freiermuth, and then 1 or 2 flashes out of Austin and the other wide receivers here, right? But as the season wraps up, we're going to see some very competitive game scripts out of the Steelers as they are going to be fighting for the best potential playoff seeding. They get Cleveland this week, then they're at Philly, then they're at Baltimore, and they get Kansas City at home. And that sounds kind of like a scary schedule, but Cleveland is fine, like we just went over. Philly is going to be tough here, but they're going to have all of that defensive pressure for the most part on George Pickens, although we know they got 2 stud corners there in Philly. So I don't know if I love Austin in that game, but it'll depend on the defensive looks he's getting, right? Then week 16 at Baltimore, don't forget, that's a good matchup, right? And that's going to be a good game script, right? Then week 17, hosting Kansas City. It sounds scary once again, but Kansas City's defense has slowly kind of been tearing off against wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends, and they're a bit banged up right now. That might change by week 17, but that that matchup there is really primarily scary for running backs. Outside of that, they're really starting to get weaker in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, quarterbacks, especially tight ends. So I don't necessarily hate the rest of season schedule here. And in week 14, he's got a great matchup against the Cleveland Browns, and he only sits at 7% rostered. And like I said, I mean, the Steelers look great. They're one of the best teams in the AFC, and it's definitely very possible that as the season progresses here in these competitive game scripts, that they start to open things up more and add another dimension to this offense. And as we've seen over the past 2 weeks, Calvin Austin could certainly be a big part of that. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 6 players to add off of the waiver wire last minute as we approach week 14 of the season and the remainder of the fantasy season, as the fantasy playoffs are right around the corner. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I can, so be sure to drop me a comment if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 14 as well as the fantasy playoffs. I will get to as many comments as I possibly can. And more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the videos, because we're going to have absolutely everything that you guys need for the remainder of the season to help you guys dominate the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.